Miss Pac-Man, a great arcade title that started life in rather dubious fashion as an unauthorized hack job of the original Pac-Man. But what a hack job it was, as I find it to be a much better game overall. Out of all the unofficial sequels and hack jobs in the Pac line, the Missus ended up being canonized by Namco, while the junk food promoting Pac-Man Plus and the Forgotten Offspring Junior Pac-Man quickly faded into obscurity, forever relegated to curious historical commodities at best. So yeah, I like me some Miss Pac-Man, and I played a whole bunch of versions of Miss Pac-Man on a variety of consoles. But the one version that sticks out on my mind the most was Tengen's port on the Sega Genesis.
Wait a minute. This isn't Genesis, this is Super Nintendo. Released in 1996 by Williams, Miss Pac-Man is the Super Nintendo port of the Sega Genesis version of the arcade classic. Now, the Genesis version was released in 1991 by Tengen and it was a pretty packed and solid conversion of Miss Pac-Man, and was considerably better than the version of Miss Pac-Man that was included as a hidden feature on the Super NES version of Pac-Man 2: The New Adventure. Maybe that's why this version took 5 years to make it to the Super NES. This iteration of Miss Pac-Man did get ported over to the original NES and looks different from its Genesis iteration. The Super NES version, aside from minute differences in presentation and controls, is virtually a carbon copy of the Genesis game. You have the same opening title screen with changed copyright details, of course. You have the same option screen with the same options. You have the same updated visuals, and the additional mazes featured in that game are practically the same thing. Essentially, if you have the Genesis version already, there's practically no reason to get this one unless you want slightly better sound quality, or you're somewhat like me and like to collect different versions of the same game just for the hell of it. I don't blame you, sometimes that's half the fun. So when you pop the game into the cartridge and you just start off without fiddling with any of the options, you'll be playing Miss Pac-Man as you almost remember it. The mazes from the arcade game are practically the same, the patterns are the same, the cutscenes and tight gameplay has been retained. It's near perfect in terms of the adaptation. The only major difference is the glossy look of the visuals, which make it look 16-bit-ish. Not a necessary addition, but not a distraction either, it looks fine. The other difference, one that's a little more prevalent, is the scrolling of the mazes. The mazes fill the screen and not crop to the side like in official ports of Namco games on the NES, for example, but the mazes scroll as you move up and down. This was an aspect of this conversion that I considered a negative because it was a bit distracting at first, but eventually you play the game enough times and you hardly think about it after a while. So it's not a big deal, but it is something you'd notice right away and could be a distraction at first. In addition to the original arcade mazes, Miss Pac-Man on the Super NES offers a number of additional options, such as different mazes of the small, big, and strange variety. And you also have the speed booster ability that you can either activate on a whim or the button, keep it on permanently, or disable it altogether if you prefer a pure Miss Pac-Man experience. You have multiple difficulty settings, can start on any of the first 7 levels with a limited number of continues on hand should you go beyond that. And finally, you have multiple 2-player games including simultaneous competitive and co-op modes, where player 2 takes control of Pac-Man and his one eye of ominous doom. You see, all of this stuff was conceived on another console 5 years prior, and then it was ported over to the Super Nintendo without much in terms of updating the package, outside of better sound quality, which we'll get to later. That having been said, when you compared it to, say, Space Invaders, which was ported over to the Super Nintendo about a year after this port came out, and only offered a respectable conversion of the legendary arcade shooter, but not much more than that. So unless you're really into Space Invaders, there's not much in terms of variety in gameplay. There's different visual settings, a 2-player mode that could be fun, but not much more than that. Kind of sad when you consider a couple generations ago, Space Invaders graced the Atari video computer system and got multiple gameplay modes such as Invisible Invaders, Moving Shields, which is more than what the Super Nintendo got with its port. Miss Pac-Man, however, is the kind of classic re-release I felt was done right, especially in that era of video gaming. Offered the same classic gameplay, but also offered a more multitude of options and mazes that greatly increased the replay value of the game overall. So if you got bored playing the classic arcade boards, you could try the other boards or increase the difficulty, or play with the speed booster options to greatly diversify the gameplay. It just beefs up the overall package quite nicely and generally offers more value for your dollar, especially back in the day when people were craving more advanced games with pretty graphics and explosions, and that sort of stuff. So as I mentioned before, the graphics are faithful to the original Miss Pac-Man arcade game, only with an additional glossy, shiny look to it to remind you that you're playing this on a 16-bit machine. In all honesty though, this Super Nintendo conversion practically looks identical to the Genesis version of the game. Whatever differences are evident between the two are rather minute. SNES version might be a bit smoother and more polished, slightly, but that's about it. I mean, to the naked eye, they practically both look the same. Maybe some minor color differences, that's about it. One thing that the Super Nintendo version has over the original Genesis conversion is sound quality, which is exceptional. Sound quality much more closely matches those of the arcade Ms. Pac-Man, whereas the Genesis version sounded more like the original Pac-Man than anything else, or some weird hybrid of Mr. and Mrs. Pac-Man blended together, or something. On the Super Nintendo, sound is much, much better and almost sounds like the arcade original. Not quite, but close enough. Overall, the Super NES version of Ms. Pac-Man is a solid conversion of the Genesis version of Ms. Pac-Man, itself a respectively solid conversion of the Ms. Pac-Man arcade game. The two versions of the game, like I said before, are practically identical to each other, save for the improved sound on the SNES side of Ms. Pac-Man, so outside of wanting to collect every version of the game out there, there's no real reason to get the Super NES conversion if you already have the Genesis version, or vice versa. With that piece of business out of the way, if you have a Super Nintendo, you like Pac-Man anything, and would like to play a classic Pac title without having to endure a rather mundane game to get to it, then Ms. Pac-Man is a worthwhile addition to the Super Nintendo library.